you, Rick, and thank you all for coming. And I think it's also thanks for everybody that's participating in these campaigns, because this is a critical year. And one of the things is to remember, as we all know, we are the United States of America. We are not the divided states of America. As much as people try to separate us, we need to be united for the greater good of everyone. And there's one candidate that I've had a pleasure to meet this summer that has reached out to so many people, and considering she just started to run in May, I think she knows everybody in this room. And this is a long way away from Waterbury, her hometown, but I had the pleasure to meet her early in the campaign. She looks for common ground, pushing things forward, and the amazing thing is, when we had her up to the farm, we had over 200 people come, and I said, "Do you want donors? Do you want voters?" She says, "I want young people, because it's not just about me and you, it's about the future and the young people." And there again, that shows she's a unique candidate in a lot of ways. And we're also lucky to have Maria and Chris come here today. So I would like to, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Johanna Hayes, our next congressperson.
Thank you, Gordon. You know, it doesn't take much. I look for any excuse to come back up here. You all have partnered with me on this journey from the very beginning, and I just so appreciate you. I appreciate your trust, your confidence, your willingness to listen, your sharing your stories and your families with me. You're inviting me into your homes. You're welcoming me with open arms, and just helping to remind me of how similar we are. So for that, I thank you. I also want to say, I also want to say, I disagree on one thing. I don't think that we are going to have to drag people, pull people, push people, cattle prod people to the polls on election day. Because I think people are compelled to vote right now. I think people are reminded of just how important this election is. I think people are inspired and obligated to do their part to make sure that the fundamental ideas that we believe in, that we value, our moral center is not compromised. I think people who have sat by passively and just voted and done things incrementally are now saying, how can I be better? What more can I do? And that's why we're all here today, because people believe in the possibility of who we can be and how much better we can be when we work together. We are not here today because we're afraid of democracy. We're here because we believe in democracy, and we believe in our part in that process. And if you need to be reminded, let me tell you about a group of young people in Kent last night, many of them not even old enough to vote, who were on the phone banking, getting involved, calling people, doing their part. So when people say to me, young people don't vote, my response is always, give them a reason. So thank you guys. One of the very unique things that I bring to this race, and one of the things that my profession has taught me, when you're a teacher, you walk into a classroom and you're greeted by students. You don't get to pick and choose who you will teach. You meet students where they are, you meet their parents and their families where they are. So this ability to collaborate, to communicate, to advocate for whoever is in front of you is ingrained in my DNA. I never had the luxury of asking a student, is your parent a Republican or a Democrat? Because that's how I will decide how hard I'll work for you. We don't come that way. We deal with things as they are. We leave people better than they came. We advocate for whoever's in front of us. We use our voice to help the people in our communities. That's what I intend to do as a representative. That's why I'm running for this, because this idea, this zero-sum game, this all or nothing is not who we are. That's not how we operate. That's not what we believe in. This idea that either it's America first or we're a country that welcomes immigrants. You don't have to have one or the other. We can have both. This idea that the economy thrives or we protect the environment. You don't have to have one or the other. You can have both. This idea that we keep our communities safe or we arm teachers is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. That is not who we are. That is not what we do. Government is about people. The purpose of government is to protect the people. All of these issues that we're talking about, all of these policies that we're talking about, when I hear those, I have the story of a family rolling in the back of my head. When you're talking about the economy, I'm thinking about the kid who came to school and said, we're moving because my dad lost his job and we can't live in our house anymore, so I have to go to another school. When we're talking about healthcare, I'm thinking about the kid who was hospitalized because he did not have dental coverage and it turned into a blood clot and they were thinking about amputating his foot. I'm thinking about the kid who misses the first week of school because they don't have a physical, because they don't have insurance to go to a doctor. When we're talking about immigration, I'm thinking about the kids who don't come to school the day after they hear something on the news because they know they're undocumented and now they're afraid. School is no longer a safe place. I'm thinking about the student who comes in and says, my grandma can't come to my graduation because she can't get a visa to come to this country. So when people are talking about policies, I'm thinking about people. And that's what our government should do. It should work in the best interest of the people that we serve. Not to protect persons or institutions, but to stand up and speak out for first the people in this district, the people in this state, the people in this country. And that's why I'm running for Congress. To use my voice and my platform to speak for you. When I entered this race, I talked a lot about all of the people who stood in intercession for me, who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, who spoke up for me when I didn't have a voice, who shared with me, who invested in me, who believed in me so that I could stand here today. Many of those people had no other reason to do that except that it was the right thing to do. And then at the moment when I could stand, I used everything in me to pay it forward and invest and give back to my community. That's what good government does. That's what good government looks like. I know what happens when government works. I am what happens when government works. So I could not be more pleased, more humbled, more honored to just stand here because as a history teacher, I have had a front row seat to the future. We have a generation of young people who we're not even paying attention to, who everything they touch turns into gold. They are innovative and creative, and they have ideas, and they are critical thinkers, and they question things, and they ask the most simplistic questions that leave you thinking, I don't know why we do it that way. We have not stopped to invite them into this process, to ask them for their vote, to tell them that their voices matter and that they are important. And it's time that we did that. We have to share this journey. We have to expand our electorate. Because when we go back to them in 2020 and say we need your help, they won't be there. We need to make sure that we let them know that they have value and they are meaningful and that we need them. And more important than we need them, we want them to engage. That's what I've really tried to do, to make sure that I diversified the delivery of my message so that all people could find themselves represented in everything that I did. No matter who you were, no matter where you came from, diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of background, religious, race, ethnicity, everything. All people have value, no matter what your sexual orientation is, what community you come from. All people have value. All people get to be here. No one group should be marginalized, and that is what democracy looks like. Connecticut Democrats have put together this dynamic team so that you don't even have to think about it. Somebody on this team is fighting for what you believe in. We have done the heavy lifting and the hard work and put together a group of people that exemplifies who every one of us are, who will touch every group in this room. We have a ticket that says we care about you. Trust us with your vote. Let us carry your voice to Washington, to Hartford, to your local communities. Let us be your representative. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the person, because I remind people, you can't vote for me and send me to Washington alone. That's just not fair. We need backup at the state level so that what I'm fighting for in Washington trickles down to the state and you'll see the effects of it in your community. That won't happen unless we have strong people at every level backing each other up and supporting the work that we know is important and the work that we want to do. And your representative in this district, which I'm sure you know of, State Representative candidate Maria Moore.
She's a terrible act to follow, except that it means that I get to be on stage with her, and that is a tremendous privilege at every stage of this game. To go to her point about what pride it is, how much pride it gives me to be on a slate with so many other incredible candidates this year who really want to represent you in Hartford, in Washington. It is a powerful thing. And I mean, I was late this morning because we had we were knocking on doors in Norfolk, and too many people showed up. And we had to scramble to make sure that we had enough paperwork for everybody. And of course, when people are together, they want to talk. Particularly now, there's so much momentum building into the next couple weeks that people want to know where, what's happening and what's next and where's the next rally, and I want to go, and is Johanna going to be there? And earlier this week, I knocked with a 5th grader, so I'm really glad to see this group sitting up here on the floor. And you really feel the voice of the future, because knocking with this little girl, I mean, direct questions. I was trying to explain, I was trying to be kind of high level. Well, why not? Why? What are we going to do there? Who are they? What are they, just really unafraid of asking the really straight, go-for-it questions. And it was really exciting to be with her, and I kept introducing her as she's going to be the next representative for the 64th District. I also want to talk about, another point I think Johanna draws on, which is just and I've talked about this in the debate recently, that we have more unaffiliated voters than any other kind in Connecticut. And what I see happening a lot is voters of all kinds, Republicans, Democrats, unaffiliated, taking a look at what party affiliation means and understanding that parties at their best are containers for values. And if you don't know what's inside that container, then it's not worth much. And if you think that somebody has poked a hole in the bottom of that container and all the values have drained out, then you have another problem. And I think this is a year where I really feel across voters, people running for office across the spectrum are looking inside those containers and saying, what's in here? What does it mean, that I don't want my family to be one healthcare crisis away from losing their house? How am I going to vote in order to make that happen? Who's standing up for that? How do I make sure that my public school is supported with the funding that it was promised? And that it has teachers who are given, what they need in order to serve their students. Who says that and who's doing it? There's a distinction, I think, across the board here, and a whole host of values that I strongly believe the Democratic Party is fighting for in Hartford, in Washington, and at the local level. Chris Murphy's Speaking of Democratic candidates that we're happy to have on the ticket. So I want to just thank you all for being here today, because this is really the moment in the campaign with the days ticking by where you feel that momentum picking up, and I've analogized it to that. If there's a wave happening, now's the moment when, the energy is sucking in and people are drawing together and trying to figure out where to go and what to knock on and how to stuff an envelope and who to make phone calls to. And there are opportunities to do that for every one of us, and we really need you, and we're so grateful to every one of you who show up wherever it is, in the icebox of Norfolk, knocking on doors, and there was snow in the air, I'm just saying. To, rainy summer days this summer, and to whatever's going to happen in the next couple weeks. So with that, where is he? I will introduce you, Senator Murphy.
I thought only Johanna got those receptions. It's good that listen, awesome. This is fantastic. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry that I missed the beginning of the program today, but it's always great to be back here in Cornwall. Great to be here with Gordon. Fantastic to be here with Maria. She and I got the chance to go out and knock some doors a few weeks ago, and of course, amazing to be here with Johanna. And thank you to all of the students who helped put this together. I know they've been a big part of Johanna's campaign, and thank you to many friends who are here with us today. I know we want to answer some questions. I think that's the program here, so I will be fairly brief, except to say thank you for giving me this gift of getting to be Connecticut's United States Senator, and then for 6 years prior getting to occupy the seat that Johanna is running for. This is a dream come true for me. I've talked about this in the past, but only in this country could the son of a mother who grew up in public housing in New Britain, Connecticut, get to represent this state that has meant so much to me and my family. And I'm learning every single day about how to stand up for Connecticut values and how to be a better advocate for the things that we care about. And you all have been a big part of that learning curve for me. But the job has seemed much more serious in the last couple of years. And I'm sure Johanna and others have laid out the stakes for you as we head into the final 2 weeks. But I really believe that democracy is on the ballot. It is not just about all of these different issues that we care about. Yes, the future of immigration reform is on the ballot, and the Affordable Care Act is on the ballot, and the future of our tax code, and the security of our social safety net, all of that really matters. But I just think it's important every now and again for us to remember that the founding principles of this country are revolutionary and radical. These ideas that are the heart of America, right? In the founding document, it says all men are created equal, and of course that was deeply flawed from the beginning. It was already, only referring to half the population, and even all men weren't created equal at the time. But that idea of equality, right? That idea, that founding principle of equality that we have been seeking to perfect every single day since, that we still have a long way to go before we perfect, that's a radical revolutionary idea. The idea of due process, right? This expectation that nothing is going to be taken from you from your government unless you have the ability to protest. That idea of due process, that the haves cannot take from the have-nots unless there is a process, unless there is an ability for you to stand up for your rights. That is a revolutionary and radical idea. And then maybe the most revolutionary and radical idea of America is this idea that we are stronger in our diversity, that in this country, unique amongst all of those in the world, we are stronger because we are not all the same. Miracle that is, that you get to come to this country, the United States of America, that you get to come here from different parts of the world, practicing different religions, looking a little bit different, maybe speaking a different language, and you can come to this country and retain some part of your heritage and then adopt something that is of the whole. And this country, those three concepts, the idea of equality, the idea of due process, the idea of strength and multiculturalism and diversity, those are radical ideas that get tested every now and again, right? That they get tested every now and again. And they get tested because they are unnatural. And I know that sounds strange, but they are, right? I mean, some of you have heard me say this, and Johanna has before, but we don't observe due process and equal protection in many of the other things in our life other than government, right? We don't run our workplaces through a democratic vote, right? My 10-year-old, my 6-year-old really matter to me, but they don't really have due process in my house, right? Families don't work that way. And so we don't actually reserve democracy for a lot of other things in our lives that are really important, but we reserve it for our government. We've decided that when we're talking about the whole thing, when we're talking about the way in which our communities are run, we're gonna have these ideas at the core, but they're unnatural, meaning that when somebody stands up, when a demagogue emerges and says, you know what, this is inefficient. It's better if we just get rid of these nuisances like due process or the free press or the independence of law enforcement, right? All of that is attractive because it reminds you that, yeah, it is a little bit more efficient when one person makes decisions rather than us all trying to make them collectively. And so these challenges to due process and to equal protection, sometimes people listen to them, as does the idea that we are defined by our differences. What I've learned over the years is that tribalism is biological, that unfortunately there's a piece of us inside that when we feel threatened wants to retreat into a corner in which people that look like us and sound like us and come from the same family as us are in one place. And so when we have a leader who tries to divide us, there's unfortunately some people who listen to that argument as well. And so this is a moment where we have to stand up loudly for those founding ideas and ideals. And I just feel lucky that we're all here. I feel lucky that I'm in the position to be on the ballot in a year like this with amazing people like Johanna and Maria and David and others, because this is kind of your ticket price as an American citizen, is recognizing when these threats come and deciding that we're going to go do work. We're going to go do work to make sure that this experiment, which has been around for 240 years, sticks around for another 240 years. And so you're here because you've got these individual issues that you care deeply about. And I don't want to diminish, right, the fact that we are making a decision about common sense immigration policy, and this governor's election is absolutely about whether the funding for this place and schools all across Connecticut get gutted by a governor who has no notion of how the state budget works, the Republican gubernatorial candidate. Certainly, we've got a big fight in Washington coming up on a number of major healthcare fronts, whether it's the future of Medicare and Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act. Those issue buckets still really, really matter, but in some sense the fight is even bigger, even bigger. We are in the business of saving America right now. And I'll be quiet, and I'll sit down, but one of the silver linings of this moment is that we get these amazing candidates who would have never, ever stepped up and run if not for this moment. And you've heard Johanna tell her story, but she would have never stepped up and interrupted what was an amazing life, right? Standing up for kids in Waterbury, if not for this moment. Maria, who's had this amazing private sector career. David, who's done so much great work at the local level, would have never run if they didn't recognize that moment. And the byproduct of the challenge that we're facing today is not just that we're going to win this November and we're going to reset the moral compass of this nation. That's a good byproduct. But you're going to get Johanna for a long time. You know? And she's gotten to meet all these amazing candidates who are stepping up all across the country, who are going to be part of our democratic process for a long time going forward. And that refresher that happens when these moments of challenge comes, that's sustaining. And there have been those moments in the past where it occurred. You look at frankly, you look at this corner of the world. You remember who this corner of the world elected, I would argue, the last time that we had a big challenge like this, which was Watergate, right? We were sort of asking ourselves, right, are we still in it? Are we going to do the things necessary to protect ourselves from the assault that we just saw? And this corner of the world elected a radical reformer named Toby Moffett to the United States Congress, but it's moments like that where you get this new blood into the process, and I think this is going to be looked back on as one of those years. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for stepping up. You're here because you've self-selected. You already know that this is one of those special moments. But go out over the next week as we get ready for the final week of the election and find one of your friends, one of your neighbors, who has never, ever thought to participate in politics, who's never thought to pick up a phone, go knock a door, but who knows that something doesn't smell right now, and convince them that they'll feel better about themselves if they participate. There are actually few people who come out and volunteer for a candidate who don't ever come back, because it is actually much more fulfilling, personally, than you imagine. And people, frankly, that you are talking to, voters out there, are much nicer than you think they are when you're knocking on their doors or calling them. Encourage somebody that has never stepped their toe into political waters to do it in the next 2 weeks. Convince them that as you believe, as I believe, as Johanna believes, and others, that this year it's that important. So thank you, everybody.
I'm quickly going to show a behavior that I hope to have the chance to show in the legislature, which is to acknowledge a mistake that I made a few minutes ago, which was not introducing David Lawson, who is running for state senate.
How is everybody this afternoon? It's a gorgeous day, and I'll be brief because, you know, speaking after these three is a rather difficult task. But I too am running for Senate. It just happens to be the state Senate, the 30th district, which spans from Brookfield all the way here to Cornwall, up to Salisbury, Sharon, Winsted, parts of Torrington. And we have a dilemma in the state Senate right now, and that is it's an 18-18 deadlock. I'm pretty sure you saw what happened last year, which in a nutshell is nothing. And I plan on breaking that. We must break that. One of the things knocking on doors, and being a retired teacher myself, is we're neglecting our potential. We really are. We are not investing in our best resource, our people, our students, all of us. We are not doing that. And what came to mind for the last 20 years, I've been accompanying my father, a World War II combat veteran, to his reunions all over the country: Wichita, Kansas City, San Francisco, Washington. At the conclusion of World War II, this country was in debt. Major, major debt. What did we do? We invested in our GIs. We said, if you want to go to school, you can go to school and we'll pay for it. We said, hey, we need to take care of you. And the VA hospitals were ramped up to take care of our veterans. We invested in our people. We have to start doing that now. Our healthcare is spiraling out of control. Education costs, if any of you know anybody that went to university or even a state college, you're graduating with huge debt. And then they say, oh, by the way, save 18% of your income so you can retire. It's impossible. We must change that culture. And we hope to do it at the state and the national level within the next couple of years. Thanks for coming out this afternoon.
Have a round of applause for all the candidates. It's been very brief to take a few questions from the audience. So if you have a question, shout it out.
This is a question for the senator. Chris, as you mentioned, there are many, many issues facing you and your colleagues today. But since you're on the Foreign Relations Committee, I'll just ask you, how do you feel about our having pulled out of the INT missile treaty just yesterday?
Yeah. Well, the announcement was made yesterday. So I haven't seen any of the paperwork from the administration, nor have I spent any time with them to listen to their rationale. So you're just going to get my very early thoughts on it. This is a very important treaty that we have been working with the Russians on compliance for a long time. It has gotten much more difficult recently. The president is not wrong. There have been some serious violations of this treaty by the Russians in the recent years, and that has been very frustrating to U.S. negotiators. It has been made harder to cure by the fact that for most of the last 2 years, President Trump has not had people in the non-proliferation slots at the State Department that would actually seek to cure Russia's non-compliance. And so he is not wrong to complain, but he has not done much to try to remedy those complaints over the last few years. And many of us have believed that we are much better off trying to work at that compliance rather than walking away from the treaty wholesale. I don't know the reasons why they've decided to do this. I hope it's not to simply change the subject or to try to show that he's tough on Russia, given some of the allegations that's swirling around him. But the most egregious violations from the Russian side, when you look at the history of the treaty, have been fairly recent. There have been some fairly serious abrogations of the treaty language in the last few years. And not to say that we should excuse that, but it doesn't feel like we have done the due diligence to try to get them back in compliance, walking away from it, which allows them to essentially continue the development of the kind of technology that was in violation of the treaty without any constraints posing existential threats, especially to their immediate neighbors, because we're talking about intermediate missiles here, is potentially catastrophic. Putin is looking for ways to have the chains taken off of him militarily, and one of the ways that we restrained him were these series of treaties. As you know, the New START treaty is back up for renegotiation, and it makes it much harder to do another round on START if we are backing out of this treaty. So I'm very concerned about it. I haven't been happy over the last few years about Russian non-compliance, but my theory of the case is that we likely would have been much better off trying to get compliance inside, and I worry about the president's motivations for pulling out of the treaty.
Could you just, for the students in the audience, could you just briefly sum up the non-proliferation treaty?
Well, so there's a series of nuclear treaties with the Russians regarding restrictions on testing, restrictions on intermediate missiles. We made this decision a long time ago that we were going to continue, both as Russians and Americans, to have long-range missiles, but that intermediate missiles that you could use for sort of smaller scale warfare, we were going to attempt to phase out. And so these are a series of treaties that limit the number of nuclear warheads that you can have, the types of nuclear warheads you can have, and then the testing of new nuclear devices. Yes.
My question is about healthcare, and I direct it to you because we've known each other for a long time, and you know my history, but it dwindles down to all stages of government. And my 32-year fight, not only with cancer, but with healthcare, trying to get affordable healthcare, and your vote for the Affordable Care Act, saved me and my family from financial ruin, and I was able to get the care that I needed. I wanted to let you know I finally made it to Medicare. Yay! And that I'm fired up and I'm ready to go for Medicare for all, because nobody should have to go through what I went through. And I hope all you people are with me on this. We need healthcare for all.
I'd love, Jana has spoken so wonderfully about this issue of healthcare, especially through the prism of a teacher, seeing what happens to kids who don't have healthcare when they try to come to school and learn. I will just say this, some people may or may not know, I invited a few years ago Susie to be my guest at a State of the Union speech because, unfortunately, her struggle with trying to scrape together insurance reimbursement to cover her during her periods of great healthcare need is not unique. And in fact, millions and millions of families all across this country prior to the Affordable Care Act went bankrupt simply because of medical debt. There was this one family in Meriden that I think all the time about where they had insurance through the husband's work their entire life. He switched jobs once, and when he switched jobs, he was in between for a week. And during that week, the son got diagnosed with cancer. And when they went to sign up for the new employer's insurance, they would not cover the son because he had a pre-existing condition. 1 week. This family, you can imagine how the story goes, lost everything. They blew through every savings account they had. They ended up mortgaging every property they had. They essentially became financially ruined because of the misfortune of a diagnosis and the misfortune of that diagnosis happening during the 7-day period of time where that family didn't have insurance. Those stories, like the Bergers and Meriden and Susie's, are fewer and further between today. The number of personal bankruptcies in this country in 5 short years since we passed the Affordable Care Act has been cut in half. We still got a long way to go. But that's pretty impressive.
The question of healthcare has come up a lot to me on the campaign trail, and I think that what I always remind people is that it's not just about even defending the Affordable Care Act. We all know there were some things about this act that were great. We lowered the number of uninsured and underinsured people in the state of Connecticut, the protection against pre-existing conditions that Senator Murphy just talked about, the ability of my children to stay on my insurance. There were lots of things, but we saw around the country, Connecticut did a great job with introducing the marketplace and allowing people to sign up. Other places did not do so well, so that's something we can work on to improve. Things like more competition, making it truly affordable so that everyone can have access. But I think the thing that is frustrating for me when we talk about health insurance is this idea that we always want to move forward. We always want to have more people insured at every stage, not tear it down and start all over as administrations change. So when we're having discussions about repealing, no one can dispute or deny the fact that more people were insured. So what I would propose is say, okay, let's look at what worked, continue to duplicate it. Let's look at what did not work and correct it. But under no circumstances should we ever be going back to a time where less people were insured. It doesn't matter who the author was, doesn't matter who introduced it, doesn't matter how it came about. More people got healthy, period. So this idea of repealing and starting all over, we can't go back to that. Yes.
I will be very quick, I promise, but I think it's important just to mention here that what's happening at the federal level has an impact at the state. It's not purely a federal issue or purely a state issue. The sabotage of the Affordable Care Act has caused costs in this district to go up by over $1,000 for an individual, over $3,000 for a family or older couple. So Connecticut needs to do things to shore up its protections for its citizens. And one of them is, Connecticut is one of the first states to have expanded Medicaid and reduced our uninsured rate dramatically from over 30% to around 9%. So that was a dramatic success. But what happens now is, and it happens again and again if people I talk to, is families who are served really well by Connecticut's Husky Health System, which is Connecticut's Medicaid, make just enough money to graduate out of it and the walls come crashing in. Their expenses go crazy, they have to deal with a complicated network of physicians that's completely different, and what they want is to get back into that system, to buy back into a system that works for them, that's cost effective, and that creates the right incentives. You don't want to set people up so that they are, no, don't pay me more because then I'm going to lose my health care. That's a terrible set of incentives, and the state, that's where that needs to change.
Very, very quickly, but back to what I was saying when I first spoke to you, and that's a question of investing in our people. A healthy Connecticut, a healthy United States is a productive United States. We must get our priorities straight in Hartford and in Washington. You've got the representation to do it. Let's send us all there to take care of it.
I'd like to speak for the Boomerang kids. Thank you.
And the Boomerang kids are the 20-somethings who are on their way back to this small town that they all said they would never come back to because they can't afford health insurance, they can't afford to pay their student loans, they can't afford a house, an apartment, even a shared place to live in anywhere where there's work. And so what I'm trying to say to all of you who are pointing out amazing strategies for dealing with the issues is it's like a bowl of spaghetti, right? You pull one piece and the whole tangle comes out the bowl. And I don't know, my primary thing is these kids don't have anywhere to live, never mind get a job. What are we gonna do for this affordable housing crisis that's going on all over the country and here in Connecticut? We're losing our kids.
Well, I'll just speak to that just very briefly, but you just reminded me of something. So I have my opponent, first of all, I've had a series of debates and literally I was, just sunken when my opponent's response to student loan debt, we have the third highest in all of the country, was it is their fault. It is the students' fault, and they bring it upon themselves. They need to have a conversation with their parents before they decide to go to school. And
Oh, like we didn't do that?
and my concern about that answer was, well, what about the students who don't have a parent to have that conversation with? How do we end these cycles of poverty if people can't even break it by moving forward? As a teacher, high school teacher, I've had many students leave the state and, like you said, want to come back and can't find affordable housing, can't find work. I think these are all, and this is why, as I'm campaigning and I hear people ask me about, how do you feel about healthcare, or how do you feel about the environment, or how do you feel about the economy? All of these questions in silo, in my mind, they're all interconnected, because every one of them has a ripple effect on the other. We have students who have tremendous debt, who then are forced to come home, who want to find a job, but most of the jobs are outside of the city where they live, and we don't have the infrastructure to transport them to the big cities, and they can't find housing because they don't have all of these things. It's like a series of unfortunate events.
Yes.
So we have to look at the interconnectedness of all of these things. I have many young students who go to college in another state where they don't need a car because everything is right there. They have thriving main streets. They walk to everything. They have transportation hubs, and all of this is important. I think those are the types of things that we have to look at. I was floored to find out in the last 8 years, we've had a Republican-controlled Ways and Means Committee that has had over 400 committee and subcommittee meetings to talk about how do we deal with our crumbling infrastructure, not just in the state, but in this whole nation. And in those 400 meetings, one witness who testified for 5 minutes. If we're not even willing to have the conversations about how do we bring in all the stakeholders, bring in, our community developers, do public-private partnerships so that we can offer incentives for people who move back to the state, for students who come back to live and work in our state, to have either debt forgiveness or reduced loan rates, to say that we are making sure that our public education system works, because many young families, that's how they decide what communities they're going to live in. So I think we have to remember that all of these things are interconnected, and the only way it works is if we're listening to how every single group is affected.
I'll just share one anecdote that has been keeping me up at nights. I already had seen this data, I knew it, but I saw it in a different way just a couple weeks ago. So I turned 45 this summer, and I threw myself a birthday party fundraiser. And somebody gave me a card that I sort of didn't look at until a couple weeks ago. They gave me a card that was a snapshot of my birth year, 1973, and it had all the top songs, the top movies, and in it they had one sheet where it was the cost of living in 1973. And I looked at all the things and how much they cost in 1973, and it's just like something about it didn't look right. And so I just sat in my kitchen table one night after I got home from a long day of events, and I did out the numbers. I went on my phone and I checked what all those numbers were today, how much food was today, how much the college tuition was today, compared it back. And I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know, but it was just striking to me when I sort of looked at it in a snapshot of my life. So from 1973 until today, the cost of an average house has increased 10 times. The cost of a college tuition has increased about 12 to 15 times. The cost of a new car has increased about 11 times. The cost of food has increased at a lower rate, but it's still about 4 to 5 times as much money today to buy a loaf of bread or a carton of eggs as it was in 1973. The thing that didn't look right was the one item on that list that hadn't increased 10 times or 11 times or 12 times or 4 times, but it only increased 2 times, was double what it was in 1973. Average income, right? Average salary has doubled since 1973, while everything else has gone up by a factor of 10. And so what you have in this country is a cost crisis, but really a wage crisis, really a salary crisis. whereby GDP has been steadily increasing by 3% a year and wages and salaries have been flat. And so that's why we have to be sort of radical on the idea of delivering higher wages. That's why that big goal of a $15 minimum wage matters so much, because it resets the whole wage scale for everybody else. That's why I believe in collective bargaining and unions, right? Because that's how people get access to higher wages. That's why the last thing you should be doing when you're trying to increase the ability of kids to survive is to be writing a tax bill that delivers 80% of the tax cut to the richest 1% of Americans, which just further exacerbates that inequality. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do to make the costs lower, and I'm totally with Johanna on affordability of housing and college tuition. But the thing that stands out when you look at what has changed in 45 years is not necessarily the pace of cost increase, it's the pace of wage stagnation, and we've got to be hyper-focused on that.
All my life, and what I see today is the growing inequality. You just highlighted the challenge for education and healthcare. But what's I've been a Democrat all my life. I've been voting since the 60s. But what I see today is the growing inequality, the challenge for infrastructure, for healthcare, and the huge deficit we had. The problem was in 1964, 70% of people, when consulted, had confidence in government following the Civil Rights Act. Today, it's less than 20%. If we don't have people confident in government, government's the only entity that can really deal with these problems. It cannot be done by the private sector at all. That's what we're hearing. How do we restore confidence in government so there's support for government? Because we are going to have to increase taxes. We're going to have to really deal with inequality, but only the government can do that. And yet we don't really have confidence that the government is really capable of doing it. And the challenge, it seems to me, for the Democrats is to restore that. Because in the sense, the highest level it was when Johnson was president as a Democrat. The Republicans have really taken away that confidence and really tried to persuade the society that it's a private sector that really can do all these issues, but they can't. So what do we do? Because if we don't have confidence in government, we're not going to be able to get the resources you have identified that are necessary to deal with this issue, especially inequality.
Education. I'll pass the microphone, but you just reminded me of something. People have asked me, how did you get so many young people to volunteer on your campaign, to work on your campaign? Just really helping them understand what it means, you know, the power that the government holds and all of those things, and really refocusing the narrative. Part of my campaign, we would do what we call civics chats. Every Saturday, I would go to Facebook Live and say, this is how you register to vote. This is where you find out where your polling location is. This is the job of a representative. Just in very basic terms, having that civic education, which I think we've moved away from. So to bring that generation in, but I think for the people who have already been engaged, just staying informed and really, this is, and we've talked about this election is really an election of our values, of our morals, of our integrity. When you say how do you, I'm confident in the things that I trust. I'm confident in the people that I trust. So we have some serious trust issues right now, you know, and when someone shows you who they are, believe them. You know, we have to have people in office that we can trust, that we are confident are voting on our behalf and have the best interests of people in mind. But I always know that when I am reaching out to, like I love the question here when you said explain what that means. Because there are so many people who don't even know the questions that they should be asking. So when we begin to explain what that means and why it is important and share with our neighbors, with our friends, this information, you know, I'm amazed when people say, I don't get involved in politics, and I'm like, newsflash, you already are. Because whether you are voting or not voting, you are affected by everything that happens, by every bill that is passed, by every law, by every budget that is passed. So really just educating and informing people of you know, in the most basic ways, what these things mean.
Couple quick things. One, young people in Connecticut are registering at rates unseen for many, many years. So something is happening. So that's important. I think another aspect on the local and state level has to do with government transparency. Particularly at the state level, I just heard this myself when I decided to run. It's very difficult to understand what's happening in Hartford. The whole process is very opaque. And at the state government level, it can be the same. So one of the things that we could do much better is have people understand what it is their government is doing. And when somebody, a constituent or anyone, has a problem and they approach someone and they want to get that problem resolved, don't just resolve it for that one connected individual. Don't just fix that individual situation. Find out what caused the problem and fix the system in a way that's transparent for the next person who comes along. And that builds confidence in government as well.
I want to thank everyone for coming. We have time for one more question, but I want to, before we go to that question, I hope it's a really good one. I want to thank everybody who also helped. We have a lot of refreshments, cider and other refreshments waiting for you next door. And cookies, yes, Janet, one for you. And any of the candidates that have time to stay for a few minutes and take questions from you while you're having your cider, that would be terrific. So if we could have one last question. Gentlemen.
We have two. Can we do two?
Okay.
Because his hand is up too.
I was told you not to.
I do.
Yeah, we'll do both of them.
We'll
do both of them at the same time, and then we'll answer them together.
Sorry about that. As you were talking about the increase in costs since 1973, my mind was ticking through the potential inflationary effects of the tariffs. And that's something I haven't heard a lot of Democratic candidates talk about, but I think that maybe we should be talking about it. So my question is, do you think that's a valid area that we should be looking at? And are there CBO projections that we could bring up?
Sure. Why don't you go over and do that one? Let's answer them together.
I have another job for education. Climate change. It's an environmental issue, it's an economic issue, it's a social justice issue. And I know all of you are supportive, but I'd like to see it brought to the fore.
Sure. Yeah, two great questions. I mean, listen, I don't think you ever want to forsake your ability to use tariffs to protect your economy against unfair trade practices. And China, in particular, has been engaging in some really unfair manipulation of global markets for a long time. For a while, they were, they were manipulating their currency. A little bit less of that today, but they still are stealing our IP left and right. And so I don't necessarily want to engage in a broadside against the executive for using tariff powers, especially vis-a-vis China. The problem is he's levying tariffs against China without any coordination with our allies. It's much more effective if you're doing it in a multilateral way. And second, he is also levying tariffs against our friends and doing it illegally, by the way. He is levying these tariffs using national security powers that do not permit him to do so unless there is a true emergency presented to the nation. Tariffs are actually not just an executive function, right? Congress actually normally, according to the Constitution, has to say something before a tariff gets levied. Some of the most famous of them have, names of the congressional sponsors. So it's the way in which he's doing them that don't make sense. And when you do them ham-handedly, you do get inflation. So take lumber, for instance. I went out to a lumber yard in Connecticut to check in on how the Canadian hardwood tariffs were affecting them, and they told me a pretty simple story. They told me that, well, tariffs ultimately should act in a mechanism such that your domestic industry gets price space to carve out a bigger share of the market, The domestic lumber industry is doing the exact opposite. They are just raising their price, keeping the same share of the market, but getting a bigger profit margin. And so all that happened to the people who are selling lumber in the state is that everybody's price went up. The tariff added price on to the Canadian imports, and the domestic companies just raised their prices 20% because they could. And so sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And when you have a president who doesn't understand what a tariff is, right? I mean, this president thinks that tariffs are something that other countries pay to us. Really, that's what he thinks. He thinks, and he said this a number of times, that, you know, we're gonna be made rich because we're gonna put all these tariffs on Chinese goods and the Chinese are gonna pay us the tariffs, you know. So it's a difficulty. On the climate, I mean, I'll just say this, you know, this latest IPCC report is just frightening, and especially frightening for, you know, somebody like me with young kids who are now not going to be able to fix the problem if we don't fix it now, right? We've got about 15 years to change the trajectory of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And if we don't, then the trend line is locked in for generations. And of course, the real tragedy is that climate policy involves the Holy Grail, because you not only save the planet, but you create all these jobs. There's going to be some country in the world that's going to have all these new renewable energy jobs. Why are we giving it away to the rest of the world? We have one of the top 10 solar companies, one of the top 10 wind companies in the world, in the United States. That's ridiculous. If we had real climate policy here, a carbon tax or a cap on carbon emissions, we would create millions of jobs and we would save the world. And this election, the reason why we need young people to turn out is because they've made up their mind on climate, right? They don't see a dispute over science. Young people know that this is existential, and they want to be part of the solution, and that's why we have to get them to turn out.
Really quickly on tariffs, and historically speaking, tariff wars do not work. They just simply don't. Ask Mr. Napoleon about that when he tried it on England. Didn't work out so well. Getting back to climate change, one of the things that was in front of the legislature this year was to add a few chapters on climate change into the science curriculums K through 12, which was defeated. Well, science can be rather inconvenient at times, but it's an unfortunate truth. But certainly, again, education is a key to this, green energy, and we have to get this renewables technology in a much more organized and forceful fashion.
To your question about the environment, I'm happy that you framed it in the space of education, because this is where I first realized how critically important the impact on our environment was when we talk about it. It was through education. Just really quickly, we had several years ago, the city of Waterbury had a chronic absenteeism problem and we couldn't figure it out. And one of the questions that the state posed to us was, if students aren't in school, then where are they? So we did what we thought was an absentee study, and what we found was that the majority of our students who were absent from school were absent for healthcare related incidents as a result of pediatric asthma. Either they were hospitalized, they were receiving treatment, they were going somewhere, but it was, and in my mind, what that said was, kids are not learning because they can't breathe. We have some of the south end of Waterbury has it was a huge manufacturing community, factories that have been abandoned, have not been remediated. Literally, you drive through and there are places where it says, do not walk on the grass, you know, where it's roped off and there's housing right next door to it. You know, this is a community that has suffered. The air quality is one of the poorest in the states in this particular part of Waterbury. But I look at this as, we talk about a lot of the challenges with the environment. First of all, climate change is real. I accept the science and I accept our responsibility for the man-made part of it. My opponent, on the other hand, says, maybe it's real, but he doesn't think that man-made, that people are the result of it. And, more importantly, would not do anything to abate it that would negatively affect the economy. My response to that is I am not willing to trade the environment for the economy, ever. So we have to look at it. I look at it as an opportunity. How can we bring clean energy jobs to the state of Connecticut? We're talking about a crisis of young people coming back to the state and having jobs. Believe it or not, as a teacher, I know that post-secondary education or college is not the only pathway to success for young people. We have to introduce them to the careers of the future. We have to train a talented workforce right here in Connecticut so that companies will see us as attractive, and I think we could be a hub for clean energy jobs. And not only that, we have to hold our neighbors accountable. It doesn't matter if Connecticut has these high standards if we're getting everyone else's, coal ashes and the wind is blowing everybody's dust and everybody else's the negative impact they're having on the climate and on the environment is affecting us here in Connecticut. We have to hold all of the states accountable to the same standard. That's the only way we make sure that we leave the earth in a better place and our children don't have to pay the cost of this. But in my mind, I'm thinking that these two things, once again, are interconnected, because if we begin to educate on the importance of it and then train on the types of jobs where we can have clean energy jobs right here in the state of Connecticut and make us the foundation of it, not wait for another state to do it and then we follow suit. We have the talent, the ability, and the capacity to do it right here. It first has to be a priority.
I wanted to add that not only can Connecticut be a leader here, but the Northwest corner can be a leader here, because we already, the environment is already hitting our economy. Our farms depend on the environment. Our tourism depends on the environment. Lots of small businesses are, based on having a clean environment. So the environment for us is an economic asset. It's not just a moral question. It's both. And it's also affecting, as Johanna was saying, it's economic because the costs are already being imposed. It's just that they're being imposed on other people, not the ones who are generating the profit. So it's government's job to rebalance that at the federal and at the state level. And at the state level, it's things like committing to a clean energy pact to move Connecticut towards renewables, 100% renewables by 2050, which I have signed on to. It's also doing things to ban the plastic bag, little behavioral changes that can, alleviate a situation without a huge amount of regulatory burden. So I think we around here understand this, and we need to be leaders advocating for it in Hartford.
Thank you all for coming, and I hope some of our candidates can stick around afterwards to talk to you and have some cider with you. So welcome, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.